Today is April 21, 2018, and we are continuing our discussion and study of the Gospel of Truth. So let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you for this beautiful Sabbath day. Thank you for the opportunity to contemplate truth in a more uninterrupted way. Please help us to understand the gospel of truth. Help us to understand your message, and help us to have our lives changed so that we can be the people to change the world for the better, getting rid of selfishness and error once and for all. Thank you so much for guiding us each step of the way as you have been doing. We really appreciate it. Thank you. We ask for these things knowing that it's according to the truth and thus according to your desire. And we ask it all in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so to kind of keep some of our context here, our most recent New Moon meeting was introducing to us the Gospel of Truth and considering some of what it has to say. And much of what it has to say is remarkably similar to what we already have learned in this message, although it highlights some things in a slightly different way. And it's just a very interesting and amazing text. But as Teresa very well reminded us of last night, we're not reading this because it's an interesting text. We are reading this because this is the latest thing that our Heavenly Family has guided us to. And they have guided us to consider it because it's for our benefit. It is to teach us how to view ourselves, how to view sin, how to view righteousness, and to draw us to the point of making a decision to do what is right and to give up sin and to be born again. So, yeah, this text definitely seems to have that as its aim, and it's definitely the aim of our Heavenly Family in bringing us to it. So it's really important to consider this text. Now, in looking at it so far, we've discussed several different things. I'm not going to repeat it all right now, but some of the main things that we've talked about are, first, that this text certainly is not a gnostic text, even though it's often interpreted as such, but it actually has several elements which contradict Gnosticism, and it also lacks any unique element of Gnosticism. So it is both the case that it is baseless to count it as Gnostic, and it is also the case that it can be shown to be not Gnostic. Beyond that, looking at the text, it emphasizes truth, it emphasizes knowledge, it describes the origin of error in very materialistic terms, that being a simple lack of knowledge created the possibility for misperception. And unfortunately, in a certain instance, that misperception brought about fear, which clouded judgment, and thus error was strengthened. And through this fear and terror of the Father, through a misapprehension of him, this great controversy between truth and falsehood was brought about. And then it describes how this falsehood must come to an end. And since it came about through a lack, it must be filled with substance. there's a lack of knowledge, so we must have knowledge. And the gospel of truth really eloquently and meaningfully describes these sorts of things. The last part that we were really taking time to consider is describing how Jesus is the one who really gives us the knowledge of the Father. And we're still kind of part way through that discussion, and we'll be getting back into it, kind of picking up where we left off. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask if anyone had any comments or questions on our discussion so far.
Yes, the translation you're reading, and spell it if you would.
Okay, so I'm not reading from any translation that you can just go out and buy. What I have been reading on the calls is actually a combination of many different translations and their notes. It's recommended for people to look at multiple different translations of any ancient text that they're reading. And by looking at those multiple different translations and understanding a bit about each, someone is able to get a fuller view of the text they're reading and hopefully a better reading of the text itself by comparing multiple translations. So this is like generally recommended good Bible study practice, and of course extends to texts outside of the quote-unquote Bible. So in this instance, what I've been reading is the product of my looking into all of the resources available to me on this text. However, I also do have a translation of it in print. It's not the one I've been reading, but I'll mention what it is for you just because I know that this one is relatively easy to find. It's called the Nag Hammadi Scriptures, and Nag Hammadi is spelled N-A-G, and that's one word, and then the next word, Hammadi, is H-A-M-M-A-D-I.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Hey,
not
Trent?
a problem. Yes?
I have a question. I'm not sure how to ask it without just reading it first. We were reading several different translations today, and we were kind of hung up trying to figure out what was going on in this one part. And the only way I know to do this, because there's not like lines indicated or even the paragraphs within different translations are broken up differently. So this is a translation by Robert M. Grant. And in that translation, it's the fourth paragraph, just to give you a rough idea that it is towards the beginning. That this is the gospel of him whom they seek, which he has revealed to the perfect through the mercies of the Father as the hidden mystery, Jesus the Christ. Through him, he enlightened those who were in darkness because of forgetfulness. He enlightened them and gave them a path, and that path is the truth which he taught them. For this reason, error was angry with him, so it persecuted him. It was distressed by him, so it made him powerless. He was nailed to a cross. He became a fruit of the knowledge of the Father. He did not, however, destroy them because they ate of it. He rather caused those who ate of it to be joyful because of this discovery. Now, obviously, in this translation, they're not at least communicating the she part of error. And when we're looking at other translations, that was indicated. And it kind of confused us in this whole part of him becoming powerless. For this reason, error was angry with him, so it persecuted him. It was distressed by him, so it made him powerless. In some translations, it almost appears like it made error powerless. So we were kind of confused. We saw kind of 2 or 3 different possibilities there, and wondered what you thought or what study you'd come up with on that.
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, the translation that I have in front of me right now, the Nag Hammadi Scriptures by Marvin Meyer, I'll just read that one line just to kind of hear the other reading of this, or the other translation. For this reason, error was angry with him and persecuted him. But she was restrained by him and made powerless. So, in this one, it's error that is made powerless. And I don't have all the other translations that I had available to me in front of me right now, but if I remember correctly, several others gave that reading too, and it seems to be the reading that makes a lot more sense in the context, because it seems to be contrasting the part at the beginning of the sentence with the part at the end. Because, error's angry with him and persecuted him. So it's like, see, error has the victory. But she was distressed by him and made powerless, or brought to naught. One of the other translations said either brought to naught or brought to nothing. And, I just think in the context, it seems like it's the whole thrust of the section is certainly not that Jesus was made powerless. It's actually talking about how he had a victory in spite of this terrible thing that happened to him, being persecuted and so on, because, right after that, he was nailed to a tree and became fruit of the knowledge of the Father, and, the fruit was eaten, and this is obviously described as being a good thing. And so it seems like he's really accomplishing what he ultimately wanted to accomplish. And then further down, later, referring to Jesus, it says he became a guide, a person of rest, and so on and so forth. And, people tried to refute him, but they didn't succeed. And so, kind of continuing on with the rest of what it says about Jesus, it appears that he is not powerless. So I think that the translation, which has error being powerless, makes a whole lot more sense in the context, which is actually, when there's multiple possible translations of something, translators usually try to figure out which makes most sense in the context of the actual discussion. So that's why I think that this one is the better translation.
I might also say that the translation I was reading today also says she was made powerless.
Okay, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I just thought that there is a possibility, we kind of agreed that the whole flavor of the paragraph and everything, it made sense. The only thing that threw us was that next sentence, it was like, he's made powerless, he was nailed to a cross, then he became the knowledge of it's sort of like he was made powerless so that he was able to get nailed to the cross, but then he triumphed as he became fruit of the knowledge of the Father. So, that's kind of what was throwing us. And you can see that that's probably what threw the translator.
Yeah, I hear you. And hey, this is like in coming to a judgment on this, we have to remember that we are all reading this in English, kind of doing our best to understand what it says based off of multiple translations. And the manuscript is actually in Coptic, but pretty much all scholars agree that the Coptic is translated from Greek. And, whether the Greek is original or not is, I guess, another question. But, so we're kind of working with the tools to give it the best that we have. But, hey, there's a possibility it says something else. Like, is it possible that it actually says that he was brought to naught or he was made powerless? Possibly.
Can you give a... Can you give an explanation of Coptic? I'm not sure I have a good explanation of that.
Sure, I'll do that in a moment here. But yeah, I just wanted to have that clear that it's, even though from the current information that I have, it seems that the translation that says that error was made powerless makes the most sense. That doesn't mean that that's the final word on it, and I don't claim that that's the final word on it. So, we should always remain open and seek to learn more about the text and its reading. So, what I said is the best of my knowledge on it, but I could be wrong. So, yeah, does that help, Ed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Yes, Coptic. Basically, Coptic, when it's referring to a language, actually refers to an Egyptian language that was written in Greek letters. When the word Coptic is referring to people, it's referring to Egyptians, though usually Egyptians who had basically become Christian Egyptians, but so far as I know, the word Copt is actually the word for Egyptian. But Egypt became a Christian nation, and it ended up being associated with a form of Christianity which was predominant in Egypt. And then those who were adherents to that form of Christianity were also just called Coptic Christians, whether they lived in Egypt or not. But as it relates to the language, it's just an Egyptian language written in Greek letters.
Oh, okay. That helps.
Okay, cool. Are there any other questions that anyone has, or are you guys ready to dive back into the text?
I have something. I was wondering, towards the beginning, pretty close to the beginning anyway, it's referring to those of the middle. And I think it's just before the heading, ignorance of the Father brings error. I think it's just before that. So what would be the meaning of those of the middle?
So I'll just mention for everyone, as Ed pointed out, the paragraph breaks and the sections and all of that are different in different translations. So just keep that in mind. Like if someone references something like a heading or something in a particular translation and you're looking in yours and you don't see it, well, it might not be there. So don't feel like you have to keep looking forever because it's different in different translations. So like in the translation that I have in front of me, there's no heading that says ignorance of the Father brings error, but there is one that says ignorance brings error, but I think it's probably broken up at a different spot than the one that Lynn has. But anyway, the whole thing of the middle, we don't know exactly what it's referring to, other than middle is between two things, so those of the middle, it's those who are neither one thing or another. Something that seems likely within the context is people who had not fully decided between truth and error, because this is kind of the whole discussion that's being had. So that seems like a likely hypothesis anyway, but it doesn't spell out who those of the middle are. And to my knowledge, it doesn't really explain it somewhere else in this text either. So I couldn't really say for sure.
Yeah, I'm just now seeing it here. It was talking about beguiling them. She was preparing works and forgetfulness and fears in order by these means to beguile those of the middle and to make them captive. So that would evidently mean those who had really not taken a stand or gone one way or another. So she's going to beguile them and kind of like bind them and make them captive by her by causing them to have fear and forgetfulness? Would that all just go together there?
Something along those lines, yeah.
I find, of course, maybe after reading it 4 or 5 times, a person would feel more comfortable with it, but it is difficult at times. It's like, who would write a sentence like that? But it's just people translating it, of course. But sometimes the sentences are written in a way that it's really difficult for me to follow. I'm trying my best, and so I'm trying not to let myself get hung up on a part that's difficult to me now, and wait to hear more discussion on it, and read it more than one time, and that maybe it'll make more sense. But I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all have to do, and especially, like you said, for a text that we're unfamiliar with, at first it might seem a little odd. I mean, really, with reading anything, if you just read a new author, often it takes a little bit of getting used to a different author's style. And like you said, if you're reading a translation, often translations of texts can be a bit more awkward than just reading something in its original language. So, yeah, it'll take some getting used to for us to all kind of dive into these different texts, but reading it multiple times is certainly a good way to go. Okay, so I think at this point we'll continue on our investigation of this text, and there's something that we were kind of focusing on in the latter part of last night's meeting, and that was Jesus as basically the one to teach us about the Father. So I'm going to read this next little section, and I might, after that, also skip ahead to some other things. I haven't put together a combined translation of the entire text. The next little part I'm about to read is the last that I have. And then after that, I'll switch to using Marvin Meyer's translation. And the other thing I'll say is that I am not familiar enough with the text to be able to quickly flip to different parts of it by memory. So it may take me a little bit to locate certain parts, but we'll see how that goes. So continuing on, this is a part of what is on page 19 of the Codex. So in many translations, you guys might find either at the heading or dispersed throughout the text, it'll give a number at some point. I know that Marvin Meyer's translation, at the beginning of it, it says 16,32 hyphen 17,4. And that's indicating that in this little section that he gives the title for, it covers page 16, line 31 through page 17, line 4 of the Codex that contains a translation of the Gospel of Truth, along with the Apocryphon of James and several other texts. So if you guys are following along, even though it doesn't give us the exact lines in many of these translations, hopefully we can find our place. So if you see a number 19 anywhere in the text, it should be below that I'm about to read, because this is on page 19 of the Codex, though not at the very beginning. He, referring to Jesus, became a guide, a person at peace, yet busy. In places of instruction, he came forward and spoke the word as a teacher. Those who were wise in their own eyes came to test him, but he refuted them, for they were foolish, and they hated him because they were not really wise. After all these came also the little children, to whom belongs knowledge of the Father. When they gained strength, they learned about the expressions of the Father. They knew, they were known, they were glorified, they gave glory. So here we have Jesus appearing as a teacher. Obviously, before this, back in page 18 of the Codex, it said he enlightened them and showed them the way, and that way is the truth he taught them. So when we read here that he became a guide and he instructed them and he spoke the word as a teacher, we know that he is teaching them, quote unquote, the truth, as it referred to earlier in the text. And it's interesting, it really does present him as a teacher, but he has some who resist what he says, and then others who are described as little children. Obviously, those who are teachable, as little children are. And it says, to whom belongs knowledge of the Father. So knowledge of the Father belongs to those who are as little children, ready to learn. When they gained strength, they learned about the expressions of the Father. Now, this is really interesting because prior to this, when it describes the inception of error, it's saying that it started with a misunderstanding of the Father, and that misunderstanding brought fear and terror. So it seems to be the case that this is talking about a misperception of the character of the Father. So here when it says they learned about the expressions of the Father, it's like they're learning about his character. And in doing so, it says they knew. So they actually gained knowledge. Then it says they were known. They were glorified, and they gave glory. So it's like it's describing this interplay between them and the Father. They knew the Father knew them. They were glorified, they gave glory. So this is really describing what's supposed to happen, the defeat of error and the restoration of knowledge of the truth. And that includes having this relationship with the Father as children with a parent. So this passage I find to be very beautiful, actually. So now I'm going to read the next section, and I'll be reading it from the Nag Hammadi Scriptures by Marvin Meyer. And in that translation, it is headed as The Living Book is Revealed. And apparently this actually starts on page 19, line 34 of the Codex. In their hearts, there being the little children, in their hearts, the living book of the living was revealed. The book that was written in the Father's thought and mind, and was, since the foundation of the all, in his incomprehensible nature. No one had been able to take up this book, since it had been ordained that the one who would take it up would be slain. And nothing could appear among those who believed in salvation unless that book had come out. For this reason, the merciful, faithful Jesus was patient and accepted his sufferings to the point of taking up that book, since he knew that his death would be life for many. As in the case of a will that has not been opened, the fortune of the deceased owner of the house is hidden. So also in the case of all that had been hidden, while the Father of the all was invisible, but that issues from him from whom every realm comes. Jesus appeared, put on that book, was nailed to a tree, and published the Father's edict on the cross. Oh, what a great teaching! He humbled himself even unto death. Though clothed in eternal life, he stripped off the perishable rags and clothed himself in incorruptibility, which no one can take from him. I just want to pause there for a moment to point out how this is so not Gnostic. Some scholars even say, oh, this is Gnostic. It doesn't even talk about the death of Jesus. Yeah, it does. It really, really clearly does. It talks about his death on a cross, and he humbled himself even unto death. It says he knew that his death would be life for many. So, some say that, oh, this does not teach that salvation comes through the cross of Christ. It teaches that it just comes through having a correct knowledge of how to liberate your soul from the material world. En contraire, mon frère, this text does not at all refer to liberating an immaterial soul from the material world. It talks about salvation by means of knowing the truth, and it talks about the cross as being a means of teaching us that lesson. Again, Jesus appeared, put on that book, was nailed to a tree, and published the Father's edict on the cross. Oh, what a great teaching. That's what this says. So it does talk about salvation through the cross. It says that he knew that his death would be life for many, but it's not saying that it was just some sort of event that happened to change the status of people for simply, quote-unquote, believing in that event or anything like that. No, it talks about salvation through the cross as being learning the lessons through the cross. The cross teaches us something, and that something, if accepted, brings us salvation from sin. So, yeah, this is a really beautiful text. In fact, I'm not sure I can think of a text that more clearly teaches the meaning of the cross, although Romans does teach it quite well, and the Apocryphon of James actually teaches it very, very well as well. In fact, maybe this one and the Apocryphon of James kind of teach that most clearly, but it's a lesson to learn from the cross. It's not about some sort of mystical power of the event or anything like that. But anyway, this right here, what we just read, should be enough evidence for anyone that this text isn't a Gnostic text. So, continuing on. When he entered the empty ways of fear, he passed by those stripped by forgetfulness. For he encompasses knowledge and perfection, and he proclaims what is in the heart. He teaches those who will learn, and those who will learn are the living who are inscribed in the book of the living. They learn about themselves, receiving instruction from the Father, returning to him. Since the perfection of all, or perfection of the all, as this translation says, is in the Father, all must go up to him. When all have received knowledge, they receive what is theirs and draw it to themselves. For those who are ignorant are in need, and their need is great, because they need what would make them perfect. Since the perfection of the all is in the Father, all must go up to him and receive what is theirs. He inscribed these things first, having prepared them to be given to those who came from him. And that's the end of this little section here in this translation. But it really describes how Jesus is making manifest this book. And this is a really interesting description when it says Jesus appeared, put on that book, was nailed to a tree, etc., another translation says Jesus appeared, wrapped himself in that book or in that scroll, and was nailed to a tree. It's really interesting. This describes how the contents of this book or this scroll, it's explaining the Father's thought and mind, you might say, his character. And it's saying that also in that book are inscribed or is inscribed the living, those who are willing to learn. They are inscribed in that book as well. So it tells us a few of these things, and then Jesus is the one who published it. So this gives a revelation, and if you remember last night, we read from this gospel of truth about how the Father did not reveal everything about himself, but that he would reveal basically what is necessary in order to bring people back to him. And in this section, it seems to be describing the contents of this book as the revelation of the Father's character, which Christ gave in order to impart knowledge of the Father to those who are willing to learn, so that they might be freed from the ways of error and live in harmony with truth. It's also interesting how some of the descriptions of this book are just so similar to the scroll in the hand of the Father in Revelation 5. Now, I don't know all exactly of how, these two references connect to each other, or if they do directly connect, but it's really striking. It's like this book, no one could take it up, and then Jesus was able to. Well, that's exactly what happens in Revelation 5. This is referred to as the Book of the Living. The other in Revelation is called the Lamb's Book of Life. So they're really related to each other. Also, the thing that made Jesus worthy in the Book of Revelation is that he was slain for the sake of others. And that's what happens here as well. So, and there seems to be some sort of connection, if not directly, at least in theme. And so that's something to learn more. But one of the things that we can gather from this for sure is that Jesus is described as being the one who is revealing the character of the Father. And later on, it actually refers to Jesus as being the Father's hidden self. Later, on page 24 of the Codex, it says, the Father opens his bosom, and his bosom is the Holy Spirit. He reveals his hidden self, and his hidden self is his Son. So it's like his Son is really the express image of his Father's person and makes known his character. So it's described really beautifully here. Does anyone have any comments or questions on what we've read?
Could you comment on the edict that was nailed to the cross versus the handwriting of ordinances that were nailed to the cross in Colossians? Are they related at all, or because they seem to us like they're kind of opposite things? The way the Gospel of Truth is describing this nailing of an edict to the cross versus the one in Colossians 2. Are they the same, not related?
Yeah, very interesting question. And I agree, it does seem to be kind of opposite from each other. The handwriting of ordinances, having our sins nailed to the cross, but then this is like an explanation of the Father's character. I think that they are describing two different things, and I think between the two of them, we get the lesson of the cross. On the one hand, in Colossians, the focus is on sin and, the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. And so here, it's actually the Father's edict, and ultimately the Father's edict, as it's being described here, it's this book of the living that contains the Father's character, that contains his thought and mind. And I think it really, we've talked about this before on the calls, how there's two main lessons that we know of from the cross, and that is the horrendous nature of sin and how horrible we all really are, because we, in partaking of sin, we're doing the very same thing in principle as those were doing who crucified Jesus. But then we also learn of the immensity of the love of God as manifest in Jesus, because he was willing to do anything and everything, even if it meant his life, which it did, in order to teach the truth and save people from sin. So this text is emphasizing the latter part, the latter lesson out of those two, at least in this one part, whereas Colossians 2 contains that first lesson.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
The word space and spaces is used now and then, and I didn't quite understand that either. One's right above where he affixed the edict of the Father to the cross. It says, for this, no. Above that it says, in whom every space has its source. But then further on, which I don't think you've gotten to it yet, when we come to another section that says, let's see, well, it's referring to spaces, plural. When you come to it, if you do tonight, and you feel like you can comment on it, I'd be interested in knowing what the space and spaces are.
Okay, so it says that in the translation that you have, I take it?
Yeah, it's just the first time, well, I think this is the first time it popped up, and I just kind of read past it, and then it mentioned it again. It says, having divested himself of these perishable rags, he clothed himself in incorruptibility, which no one could possibly take from him. Oh, wait a minute. I may be on the wrong spot. Hold on. Yeah, it's one of those real long sentences. Let me see if I can get to it, if I haven't lost it. Let me find that. Okay, yeah. Where it says he had been hidden as long as the Father of all was invisible and unique in himself, in whom every space has its source. For this reason, Jesus appeared. He put on that book. He was nailed to a cross. He affixed the edict of the Father to the cross. So it was mentioned slightly before that, but I just didn't understand what that was.
Okay, well, I'm not exactly sure, like that, it doesn't use the word space or spaces in the translations that I've looked at, but it might be, just judging from what you just read and comparing it with mine, I think that where yours says spaces or space, mine here says realm. And if that is the correct place, like I know the word underlying realm here, going through the Coptic back to Greek, is the word aeon, which is most often translated either age or world. So it's like a big space of time or a big space of, area, like a big space of space itself. So I could see how they could use the word space or spaces for that word. So again, it's the type of thing this word could be referring to either a long duration of time or the world itself.
Okay. It's interesting. Thank you.
Does anyone else have comments or questions on any of what we have read so far? Okay, so one of the things that I think is worth studying in the section that we just read is the relationship between this book and the scroll in Revelation. Are they referring to the same thing? If so, are these two independent sources referring to that same scroll? Or was Revelation written first and this is referring to that scroll in Revelation? Or was this written first and is Revelation building on this description of this book? But I think that it's really an important thing for us to investigate the relationship between this passage and Revelation chapter 5, because it's quite interesting. I came to a point of realizing that we know less about the scroll sealed with 7 seals than we thought we knew. And the reason for that is that I always thought, and it seems to be that most others have thought, that the content of the 7 seals is revealed in Revelation chapters 6 and 7, or the content of that scroll sealed with 7 seals is revealed therein. But in fact, that's not the case. When you read in Revelation chapter 6, and it says, "And he broke the first seal, and there appeared a white horse, and riding upon it a man with a bow," and etc., that's not describing anything written in the scroll. That's describing what John saw after the first seal on the scroll was broken. But the scroll is sealed with 7 seals, which means you cannot open up the scroll until all 7 seals are broken. And so really John's describing this visionary experience where, wow, the Lamb gets the scroll, and then the Lamb breaks the seal. And once the Lamb breaks the first seal, then something happens. This horse shows up and so on. Once he breaks the second seal, then John sees something else. But he's just seeing these things in the heavenly courts. He is not describing what's in the scroll. And so when I came to that realization, I realized, oh man, now this raises a question. What exactly is in the scroll? What's that about? And so if this relates to the scroll sealed with 7 seals, then this may be explaining some of what is actually written in the scroll. So it's important for us to study these things for sure. And I hope this also highlights the importance of understanding the broad reality of a given text that we are studying, because it's important to know which was written first, the Gospel of Truth or Revelation. Most scholars assume the Gospel of Truth to be written in the 2nd century because they connect it with Valentinus, because they think it's Gnostic. But since it's not Gnostic, that opens up the question for the date of the text. So, just something to keep in mind. With that little bit of discussion, I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say at this point, so I'll ask you again. Does anyone else have anything to say?
Can you just explain again about what you're saying about the 7 seals? Are you saying that the 7 seals really weren't revealed, and they're only revealed until they're all open?
The 7 seals are just bits of wax on a scroll, as it were. When each seal was broken, so just this is what will really help is for everyone in reading Revelation or any other text, try to visually picture what's being described. So, John says that there was a scroll. So you have to imagine, okay, so there's a scroll. So it's rolled up, and it was sealed with 7 seals. So that means on the outermost edge of this scroll, where it meets the rest of the scroll, there are 7 seals, most likely made of wax, that he saw, and they kept this scroll shut. And no one was worthy to take this scroll. And then the Lamb shows up, and the Lamb is worthy, and the Lamb takes the scroll. The first seal. So there's these 7 seals. He breaks the first one. It's like, oh, wow, there's only 6 more to go before you can open the scroll. So he breaks that first seal, and when he does, an event happens in heaven, and that event, the first one, is a white horse showing up on the scene. And then you have the progression of events. So each seal breaks, and then there's something that happens after each breaking of the seal. And so what I'm saying is that a seal being broken and an event happening doesn't tell us what's written in the scroll. And so all 7 seals have to be broken first before the scroll can be unrolled. Does that make sense?
Okay, I get it. Thanks for explaining. That really helps. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked again. It's a really important point that is so often missed, but I think that it's really important in order to correctly understand what Revelation is describing.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was just wondering because I thought that is what Houteff went through and explained from his point of view what was revealed by the seals, each of them being opened.
Right. So, yeah, Victor Houteff gave an explanation of what takes place when each seal is open. All I'm saying is that that's not telling us what is in the scroll. I totally believe that Victor Houteff's interpretation of the events that took place after each seal was opened, as symbolically represented by the horses and the other things once you get past the first 4 seals, I think his interpretation of those events is correct. But what I'm saying is that that does not tell you the actual content of the scroll.
Yeah, what I had thought is that as he opened the seals, as the seals are opened, it reveals the what they're reviewing in heaven in regards to the judgment.
Yeah, I think that that's correct as well. But again, it still just doesn't tell us what's actually written in the book. It just tells us what they are reviewing in heaven. So it's like, yes, these events take place, it's being opened, but it's only telling us what they're reviewing prior to the opening of the scroll itself.
Yeah, so you're saying it's not revealed in its own sections, like when they reveal first seal and they tell us what's being what they're reviewing. I mean, surely when all the seals are broken, then we have a complete picture. But each section isn't revealing something of what they're reviewing in history, you know?
I'm saying that they are, but that isn't describing what's written in the scroll sealed with 7 seals. That's just saying, like, so you have to visually picture it. Like, so there's a scroll, it's sealed with 7 seals, and it's kind of like if you have a chest and it has 7 different locks on it. Like, rather than having 1 lock, it has 7. Before you open the chest, you have to unlock all 7 of them. It just won't work to just unlock 1 and get inside. So same thing with the scroll. In order to actually open up the scroll and read the contents, you have to break all 7 seals. So the point is that, yes, what is being described with the various events that took place when each seal was broken is describing a review of the history of the world. But that review of the history of the world is not being done by reading the scroll. It's being done in the process of the scroll, of the seals of the scroll being broken, which is necessarily preparatory to actually opening the scroll.
Okay, you know, I guess maybe the picture I have is that you have a scroll. I think you're saying that you're having a scroll that has 7 seals on the outside. My picture is that you have a scroll that has a seal. When you break it, you can only roll it so far, then you break the next one. The seals are inside of one another. That's my picture. But I think you're saying that the seals are all on the outside of the scroll.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is just the way to do sealing a scroll. You can actually have it so it's on the inside and so on. That kind of idea comes more so from viewing it as a book, where you might be able to have like a certain section of the book locked and then another section. But when it's a scroll sealed with 7 seals, you know, John is describing what he saw. If it was only sealed with 1 seal and then you have to unscroll it a certain ways, and then there's like a seal, kind of like a piece of gum stuck in there, holding the 2 parts together, he would only see 1 seal, and he couldn't describe it as a book or a scroll sealed with 7 seals. So yeah, it's certainly the case that all 7 seals are there on the outside of the scroll, and it can't be unrolled until all 7 seals are broken.
Okay, I hear you now. Not the gum thing.
Yeah. but yeah, the gum thing, I think that's probably a good way to illustrate that idea anyway.
That would probably be messy.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I don't think that anyone in the ancient world would actually seal a scroll like that.
That's what I was going to say. The reality is that would never be done. And I would even venture to say it has never been done, because that's just not how you close something like that with a wax seal.
Right.
You never see a wax seal inside the folds of something.
Yeah.
It's only ever done to close the outside of something.
Yeah, yeah. But seriously, I mean, that's how you described it, Walter, is how I thought of it before. I thought, oh, well, this is revealing this book, and so it must be that it's just, you know, 1 seal is opened, and then you can read part way, and then another one, and then you can read part way. So I totally thought of it in that same way before. But, yeah, now it's like, it's pretty apparent that it's like, oh, no, this is actually... it cannot really be the case that the scroll is being opened at all until after the 7 seals are all broken. So another thing that I want to mention is that this may give us more insight into things like the half-an-hour silence, because that is when finally the 7th seal is broken. And what are you going to do now that this 7th seal is finally broken, when this whole thing, it's like, obviously in Revelation, this whole thing of the book is a big deal. It's like, oh, wow, there's this book in his right hand. No one can open it. No one's worthy. When the guy shows up that's worthy, people are singing praises. Like, this is a big deal. One seal is broken. Big event takes place. Second seal, big event takes place. It's like, wow, talk about drama. Like, opening this book is like the most dramatic opening of any scroll ever described so far as I know. And then finally you get to the end of it, the seventh seal is broken, now you can unroll it, and it's like, wow. And then there's silence in heaven for about the space of half an hour. Okay, so what's that about? But understanding that really all seven seals had to be broken before you can unroll the scroll, I think is necessary for getting more insight into really what takes place after the seventh seal is broken. So I don't have a full understanding of what follows, but I wanted to mention that for us all to be able to contemplate and incorporate in our study of Revelation.
I think that's exciting.
I agree.
And I think it's really incredible, the connection and the progression from last month's new moon to this month's new moon message. So last month we started studying the book of Revelation and better understanding it, not all of the contents, of course, but just understanding more of the reality of the book. And now, again, this is what our Heavenly Family sees that we need next. And lo and behold, it's very tightly connected, evidently, to the book of Revelation. So that's very notable to me, and I'm really excited about what we're going to learn.
Yeah, me too. So obviously, we're just really scraping the surface here when it comes to some of these things, but yeah, there's plenty here for us to look into.
There's so many things that we've thought we knew, and we've just held these assumptions in our mind without even realizing there is any assuming going on. And yeah, so the more times it happens, it's like, okay, it's hopefully helping us to get to the point where we'll recognize, okay, here's something that I may have some preconceived ideas on, and are there any questions that I'm not asking that I should be asking that would help me to understand this?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is all really interesting because I've been torn between listening to and reading different things today, and I was finishing up listening to a new moon study from, I think it was 2017. It was part 2, and Trent, you were explaining, how we shouldn't think of God existing in the past, present, and future at the same time, and all that. And you gave the analogy of these 3 chess players. And I thought, oh, that is the very best explanation of that I've ever heard. I understand it now, how God can predict things that should happen in the future because he's just that intelligent, far more than the smartest chess player who can predict sometimes up to 20, 21 moves or whatever they call it in chess ahead. And so I understood that part. And then someone from Toronto mentioned the 7 seals, and which is not related to the other part, I know, but I'm just trying to help you. I don't know the name of that study just off the top of my head. So that might bring it to your mind. But you also mentioned in that study the very thing you said tonight about the seals, how they each one have to be opened. Now, you didn't go into all the details of you're not going to be able to read the scroll until they're all unsealed. But I thought, oh, that's interesting, because that was kind of brought up in the past. And, the 7 seals and the wax seals and everything was brought up in that study. So this isn't the first time, but a little more detailed this time. That's all. Sorry I went on so long.
No, that's fine. Definitely. I'm sure this is something that people will notice if you go back and listen to studies. There are several things that we end up talking about in more detail that have been mentioned on previous meetings, at least in a more rough or vague or less explained way.
I just wanted to ask quickly, David Koresh, now that I understand about the scroll and the 7 seals, so I can picture it now. Sorry, can you just quickly tell us what David Koresh was saying, that he was the only one that could unseal the 7th seal, or was it was he saying that he was able to interpret each seal?
Okay, so what he was saying is that he was the only one that could unseal the 7 seals. So that, basically the way he took that is he was the only one who could open the book. He was the only one who could interpret the 7 seals. He was the one who could do all of that, and that no one else could. And basically, it had to do with the interpretation of the 7 seals. That's what it ultimately broke down to, is that he would say, hey, could you explain the 7 seals? And people would say, no, we can't. And he said, oh, of course you can't, because it says that no one can open the book. So therefore, of course, no one can do it. But what if I can? And if I can do it, if I can explain the 7 seals, that proves that I was able to open the book, and thus I'm the Lamb.
Because he, along with most of us, kind of held this assumption that the interpretation of the seals equates with the contents of the scroll that the seals were holding shut.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I thought that was the case until we recently, I was basically going through a whole lot of stuff related to Waco because of the 25-year thing and because of publishing Waco Untold. And so I was listening to the congressional hearings on Waco and all that, and listening to interviews with survivors. And in one of them, Clive Doyle and David Thibodeau, I think it was, maybe someone else, I forget, but I think it was Clive Doyle and Dave Thibodeau, they actually mentioned that I forget exactly all that they said about it, but I'm pretty sure they expressed something which let me know that they understood that the 7 seals were basically 7 seals on the scroll, and they had to be broken in order for the scroll to be unrolled. It seemed like they understood that. So I don't know if David Koresh had that misunderstanding, or if he understood that, what we just explained, that you have to actually open all 7 seals before the scroll is unrolled.
So interesting. I would like to understand what he thought about that a bit more, or what he thought he understood, because of the very fact that he misled people to think, oh, well, he's the only one that can offer an interpretation of the 7 seals, when he very well knew that Victor Houteff interpreted the 7 seals decades prior.
Right. Well, he knew that other people could offer interpretations. He just thought he was the only one that could actually explain them.
He never offered Victor Houteff.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, I agree with that point, how on one hand, he had professed Victor Houteff to be a true prophet, and on the other hand, said that no one could explain the seven seals except for him.
Right.
So it's, yeah, you know, and that's something, again, I've brought that up to people who I've talked to who believe in David Koresh even today, and yeah, they weren't familiar with Houteff's teaching on it.
Right. Now, a lot of lives might have been saved if he had just been honest about even that one thing.
Yeah.
And they would have been like, oh, why are we following you? I thought I was following you because you've interpreted this, but I never heard. Well, what does Victor Houteff have to say about this, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Did he steal Victor Houteff's teachings, and did they not know that they were his, or was he just not promoting Victor Houteff's teachings and going in a different direction?
So he did both relative to different teachings. So when it came to the premillennial kingdom, for example, this isn't the only thing, but as an example, for the premillennial kingdom, there are studies, like audio recordings of David Koresh, where he claims to have had a revelation of the entirety of the Bible in 1985, and then he says, you know, this is what God showed me, and then he goes through and gives a teaching of the premillennial kingdom that any Davidian could give, but he claimed that it was a revelation that was given to him. So that's just taking a teaching from Victor Houteff, claiming it as his own, and thus, you know, persuading people that he had something to say as a result, and kind of hiding Victor Houteff in the background. Otherwise, though, like in other instances, he just didn't present the Houteff teaching and didn't mention Houteff, and then gave his own interpretation that wasn't the same as Victor Houteff's. And that's the case for the seven seals. He gave a different interpretation for that. Didn't mention Victor Houteff's interpretation, but in this instance, it's pretty important that he didn't mention Victor Houteff's interpretation, because even mentioning it undermines his interpretation, because of the fact that he said that he was the only one that was able to explain the seven seals.
Yeah.
And, you know, he at least gave lip service to Victor Houteff as a prophet. I don't know how much he talked about Victor Houteff in the last several years, but at least while he was doing the whole Davidian, Branch Davidian thing, he totally said that Victor Houteff was a prophet. And, yeah, I mean, there were charts that he had drawn up that had Victor Houteff mentioned on them that were recovered from the fire, or from the ruins left over from the fire. And so at least some people there were still, you know, familiar with Victor Houteff and so on. And so, yeah, it's kind of important. Anyway, he did both. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, so, we've been on for about an hour and 20 minutes now, and we should probably wrap up this meeting. So we've really enjoyed going through this. The Gospel of Truth, along with the Apocryphon of James. Oh, man, these two texts are so interesting. And it does make me want to study more of the texts in the Nag Hammadi library. And actually, I'll mention, I don't know if I mentioned this before on the calls, but in the codices, both the Apocryphon of James and the Gospel of Truth are in the first of the 13 codices. So this is Codex number 1. It starts with a prayer that's attributed to Paul. And then the second text in it is the Apocryphon of James. And right after the Apocryphon of James is the Gospel of Truth. So, anyway, it comes right after, and I'm not sure exactly what comes after that, whether it's the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip or what. Those are both pretty close. But there are important texts to investigate in the Nag Hammadi library. So anyway, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, thank you once again for never ceasing to amaze us with truth. Thank you for your patience in our learning process. And we ask that not only we take these in theory, but apply them in our lives so that we may be able to share ultimately with others. So be with us, be with every one of us, and thank you for all of your blessings. In the name of Grant, she and she. Amen.
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 All right. Shalom, everyone.
Shalom.